Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Alright, I swear I'm not making this up. When I lived in Texas, there was this stormy night. Like an unusually strong storm. Plenty of lightning and thunder. I had a friend over. I remember playing Morrowind and OG Halo until super late. I was lying awake and staring out the window and listening to the rain. We had called it a night about an hour before this. There was a tree outside my window with a branch I would sometimes use to get in and out of my room. For privacy reasons. And because my parents were nosy. In between some thunder, I saw something on the branch outside. A pair of eyes, large and yellow. They just appeared, right where I was already staring. In a single instant, just there. A flash of light from the storm lit the tree up. It looked like Gollum, from Lord of the Rings or something. Gangly and gray with sharp teeth. Long fingers that were holding something moving. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Whatever it was looked like it was eating something. Then he looked right at me and smiled. A far too human smile. I screamed bloody murder. Woke the whole damn house. Everyone told me to stop lying about stuff. You had too much caffeine before bed. Me and my friend did down 2 12-packs of soda between us. You were asleep. It was a nightmare. I have no idea if I was seeing things, or it was a trick of the light or anything else it could have been. But I know I was awake. It was during the summertime and I had been staying awake until sunup for over 2 weeks at that point. When I told my friend, he was skeptical, but he took my word for it. Our house was surrounded by 20 acres of woods and we had both heard some strange things in those woods. When day broke and the storm let up, we went outside near my window. On the ground right under the branch were some half-eaten field mice and tails. It has been 17 years since that day, and I still see it in my nightmares sometimes. When I think about what's out there in the dark, I remember the Gollum. Because that's what I've called it ever since.
We live in New York, specifically around the Binghamton area. We would go to the Evergreen Cemetery in Owego a lot. We would go to take pictures during the day because it was beautiful. The highest peak of the cemetery looked out over the main downtown area, and once Night said it was an incredible sight. Anyway, before this experience, I have had previous encounters after dark with my fiancé and his friends. But this was nothing like the others. After dark, this cemetery's entire ambience changes in an instant. I am hyper aware of every corner of my vision, my hearing, and I just feel incredibly uneasy. My adrenaline starts to rise. So this one night, my younger sister wanted to go see what I was talking about. So I'm sure, but we need to stay in the car. We enter the cemetery, which is a hill that evens out past the old groundskeeper's house, then around a tight right turn. This then turns into a straight hill with an open area of graves to the left and to the right. Then another branch of road to the right a little ways up. We take that turn, which you can keep following or you can turn off to leave. I stop at the small intersection and we sit in silence, taking in what we can see. The feeling of being watched creeps in after a while. My sister then starts to frantically pull my arm, and as I look at her, I notice her gaze is fixated near a gravestone. The best way I can describe what I saw is this. It looked like I was looking at the back of Gollum from the Lord of the Rings, but bigger. It was long, emaciated looking, and hairless. Then its head whipped around and locked eyes with my sister. She froze and stopped shaking my arm, so I all but slammed the car into drive and sped down the hill out of the cemetery. It all happened so fast that I wasn't able to get a good look at this thing's face, and I'm not sure I really wanted to at the time. Months passed by and my sister started experiencing strange things at her house. Waking up with unknown bruises, feeling watched every night, and just fear of being alone in her room. So I stayed over one night with her, and as we lay down for bed, she rolled towards the wall.
If you feel like something is staring at you, don't turn around.
And let me tell you, she wasn't wrong. I had a hard time falling asleep, which was weird for me because we both grew up in the house we were in, so this shouldn't have been a problem. So I'm laying on my back, eyes closed, listening to the dog chew on his bone near the closet. Then I feel this tall presence at the foot of the bed. I try not to move, thinking I'm just scaring myself because of what she said, but I was wrong. My sister, who I assumed was asleep, slowly reaches over and holds my hand under the blanket and squeezes. The blanket rips of my feet, and the feeling of cold hands on my ankles sends goosebumps throughout my body. I squeeze her hand back, waiting for it to be over. Now I never fell asleep up to this point in the night. I had been wide awake just laying there. So this happened all while being awake. The feeling and presence vanished soon after, and I curled up further on the bed and called for the dog. The next morning I had bruises covering my ankles. Needless to say, I don't spend the night over there anymore. This was a crazy experience, and I have seen this thing on other occasions while at Evergreen Cemetery, and my sister eventually was able to get this thing out of her house. It's still pretty scary to think about, and sometimes I feel a bit weird when I visit her.
What I'm going to tell you is the honest truth. I've had experiences before, but this incident, I still doubt as to what I saw. This happened 2 summers ago, 2018, in downtown Chicago. If you've ever been to downtown Chicago during the summer after working hours, you know how crowded it can get. I've been living here 13 years and I've seen my share of homeless weirdos. I commute using the subway every day and see some weird people. The city has many, and at first that's what I brushed this sighting off as. I was walking to the comic book store coming up to State Street. There's lots of shoppers and tourists going about their business when I saw what I will refer to as a homeless man on a corner on his knees. It was only when I looked at him again that I was confused. He looked like a Caucasian man that had a scar on his face that made him look a little deformed. He was wearing an oversized hat, but I could see he was bald. He was on his knees and muttering something, partially covering his face. I've never stared at someone before, but there I was in the middle of State Street, shocked and confused. He didn't look normal. His eyes were huge and I felt really sorry for him. His facial expressions just had lots of sorrow. I looked around to see if anyone had noticed him. A young boy in his teens with his dad was looking at this thing the same way I was. I heard his dad tell the young boy not to look at him, but I could see the boy was also in shock and confused. He also knew that wasn't a human. Something about this humanoid was not right. Everyone else who walked by dared not look and ignored this humanoid. It was my signal to cross the street and I walked away, but I kept turning around to get a glimpse. The last thing I remember that was odd was how his eyes blinked. It reminded me a lot of Smeagol from the Lord of the Rings movie. He didn't look real. I think about this sighting a lot and sometimes brush it off as it was just a weird-looking homeless human. The more I recall the sighting, the more I'm convinced it was not a human. That's exactly what this thing was doing. Trying to hide in plain sight in front of hundreds of people. Its mannerisms were strange too. The way it kept its head down but occasionally looking up to make eye contact was bizarre. It almost felt like I was looking at a wild animal at a zoo. Very bizarre.
In my late teens to my 30s, I would frequently go ghost hunting with my friends. This particular incident happened around 1998, and my idea of ghost hunting was going into creepy places and looking for ghosts. No equipment and no plans. Just us being stupid. We rarely even remembered to bring flashlights. The group consisted of myself and my 3 best friends, one of whom had brought along his girlfriend, who in turn brought along her best friend. The 6 of us had begun investigating an old abandoned and very unsafe creepy bar, and hence succeeded in nothing more than freaking out the 2 girls. One of my friends suggested an old ruin we knew of, so we went back to check it out. We arrived at the old ruin, which was out in the middle nowhere in Southern California's high desert, at exactly midnight. The guys all got out of the truck. The girls refused to get out. We immediately spread out. The 3 other guys moved off to their right to explore the perimeter of the property while I headed straight for the ruin. The ruin was easily identifiable by the light of the full moon. All that remained were a 3-foot-tall cinder block and rebar outline of a building on a slightly raised cement slab surrounded by rubble. It hadn't been a large building by the look of it, having a short central hall with 2 rooms on either side. No sooner do I step foot on the threshold of the building do I look up and see something. The best way I can describe this thing is when you take black and white Play-Doh and mix it together into a streaked, vaguely humanoid-shaped golem with a round head. I watched this thing, visible only from the waist up, glide smoothly from left to right just outside the far side of the ruin. As it reached the far end of the building, I calmly did an about-face and walked back to the truck. I wasn't scared. I didn't panic. Until recently, I just accepted simply that the sight of this thing had just overloaded my mind and my understanding of the world, and had simply seen enough. As I reached the truck, I realized that both girls were gazing past me towards the ruins with eyes the size of saucers. Though there was nothing there when I turned around, both girls in unison described the exact same thing I had seen and claimed it was standing in the exact same spot on the threshold where I had just been when I saw it. There's not much else to say except the girls and I waited in the truck until the others came back.
A couple years back my girlfriend and I had an encounter out in the desert off-roading late one night with two strange 3.5-feet beings that looked like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. My girlfriend was the one that noticed them first as she was shining a flashlight around and saw two sets of yellow eyes 30 feet from us up on the hillside peeking around a rock at us. She told me to stop and look, and that's when I saw them as well. We sat there for about 20 seconds looking at them, then one stepped out and started slowly making steps towards us. My girlfriend motioned for me to leave the area, and as we did she said they started moving quickly towards us. After whipping a quick U-turn and punching it back down the trail, my girlfriend suddenly said, "F is that?" And I looked in the rear view mirror and saw a bright flash of light come from behind her. I asked my girlfriend what it was because she was looking behind us the whole time and said a bright ball of light just shot up into the sky from their direction and disappeared behind the clouds. We were both freaked out, and even though I had my gun on me I was still scared. I still think about it from time to time and overthink the situation and scare myself just thinking about it. Second story. 3 months ago I woke up brown at 2:30 a.m. and went to the kitchen to get a drink, and as I turned the corner to the kitchen, a bright flash of light hit me. Then all of a sudden I felt confused and proceeded to get a drink and went back to my room. As I lay down, I looked at my phone and noticed it was 4:05 a.m. in the morning. I sat there trying to figure out what just happened and how 2 hours was just lost. I still feel lost for what happened that morning.
So this happened about 2 years ago. I'm closer to New York City, but outside of Westchester County. It has woodsy and urban areas. Before my boyfriend and I lived together, we both lived with our parents. It was about a 15 or 20-minute walk if you took the regular sidewalk, but there's abandoned railroads that basically create a shortcut. These tracks to me are scary because a lot of homeless people live there. I'm not that afraid of homeless people, but I don't want to bump into one on abandoned tracks at night. There's also been violent crimes that happened on them, and a semi-famous serial killer had even killed on these tracks in the early 90s. Basically, as a kid, I was told to stay away from it for obvious reasons, so fear of this railroad was inflicted in me at a young age. Anyway, he was walking home from my mom's one night and called me breathing heavily and freaking out, telling me he saw a skinwalker. I had literally no idea what these were until he told me. And I honestly thought he was making things up. His description: hunched over, naked and pale. Big, piercing reflective yellow eyes and very skinny. The height was about 5'8", head regular size, mouth regular. Its arms and legs were longer than the body, naked with absolutely no clothing on. No hair, literally almost identical to Voldemort from Harry Potter or the Lord of the Rings Gollum. He believes it was male. It made a deep clicking sound that almost sounded like a growl. When the thing noticed that he noticed it, it let out a huge shriek, at which point he ran the rest of the way home. I didn't believe him, but he's a tough guy and I could hear the fear in his voice, so I was concerned and did some research. Maybe 2 days later, during the day, we were walking in a different but close area of the tracks and found a pretty much newborn baby deer dead, with a piece of its backside pretty much ripped out. Like something grabbed it and ripped a chunk of its body out. It was sad and terrifying because there's nothing in my area that would have done that, and birds would have picked at its entire body, not just a small part. A day or so later, the entire body of the baby deer was gone. That's the moment I believed him, and when I started joining communities on crawlers and cryptid creatures.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
I grew up in rural Missouri. My family moved there in 1985 when I was young, about 15 or 20 minutes from the closest town, with the closest town being Wright City, Missouri, about 15 minutes north. It really was in the middle of nowhere. You had to drive a mile or two down one gravel road. Before you got to the gravel road I lived down that was about 1.5 miles long that only my family and our neighbor lived on. There was about 3,000 to 4,000 acres north of us that no one lived on, and about 1,000 acres south of us that no one lived on. It was all owned by the same guy who only came out during deer season to hunt the property south of us and lived in a town about 20 miles west. The land north of us was mostly incredibly hilly forest with a few caves about 1 mile north of a house. The land south of us was about 50-50 woods to fields with an old 100-plus-year-old abandoned cabin deep into the woods. The wagon road to it had grown up. The property owner had told us that no one had lived there since the 1800s. I had a few sightings while growing up there. I had always told myself it was Momo, the Missouri monster, Missouri's version of Bigfoot. Wasn't until I saw a trail cam photo of what was said to be a forest ghoul several years later. This led me to do a little more research. First memorable sighting was when I was a teenager. Me, my brother, sister, and dad were playing a game I learned in Boy Scouts called Manhunt that was basically a blend of hide and seek and tag. We'd set a boundary around a cedar thicket just north of the house. Me and my little brother were on a team against my dad and sister. Me and my brother would hide first, with my dad and sister eventually catching us. We then let my dad and sister hide and went to go find them. We ended up catching my sister, but couldn't find my dad, so we started working together. The cedars were thick and the sun was setting. We were probably in the last 10 minutes of daylight for the day. We wanted to catch our dad fast before we couldn't see anymore. We searched most of the area and didn't find him. Eventually, I spotted what looked like 2 feet about 20 or 30 feet in front of us. They were barefoot and pale, not thinking much of it. I told my brother I thought Dad had taken his shoes off to be more stealthy. We spread out about 20 feet apart and tried to sneak up on him from opposite sides, crouching the whole way so we could see under the cedar trees, because we couldn't see through the thicket. We got about 15 feet away before it realized we were coming up on it, and it took off. We both took off running after it, thinking it was my dad. We chased it to the edge of the thicket where there was a small open glade before the start of the large forest that spread back into the hills. We yelled that he was running out of bounds, and as we got to the edge of the thicket, we noticed what appeared to be a pale, naked man jetting into the woods. This spooked the hell out of my brother and me, but we still wanted to believe it was just my dad playing with us. So we ran the opposite direction back south towards the house, only to see my dad sitting next to my sister by a pond easily 100 yards across the field from the thicket. We asked my dad how he got over there so fast, and he and my sister told us he'd been sitting there with her for 20 minutes waiting for us to figure out he wasn't in the woods. My brother and I tried to explain what we saw to him, but he blew it off, saying it was probably just a deer. Meanwhile, we had chickens multiple times as I was growing up. Normally they'd be fine in the chicken coop for a few months. Then something would start killing them, tearing open the wire fencing to the caged yard. Usually we'd find 1 or 2 chickens just torn up and laying in the yard. My mom and dad always said it was wild dogs, but the chickens never looked eaten, just slaughtered. He'd always repaired the fencing, yet it kept happening. Usually once it started, most of our chickens would be dead and gone within a week or 2. My mom would be upset since she's the one that wanted to have chickens and would normally give up on them until the next spring when she'd get a couple dozen more. Sometimes she'd skip a year, but I can think of at least 4 or 5 occasions of getting batches of chickens and them all die. Eventually she gave up and took a few years off from trying to raise chickens. During my senior year of high school, she decided to try having chickens again. It was good at first. Then a couple months later, they started getting killed again. This time though, it was peeling off the wire roof of the caged yard. Cage was about 5 to 6 feet tall. My dad said it was dogs, but the opening would normally be a few feet off the ground. I remember questioning my dad at that point, saying if it was dogs, wouldn't they be trying to dig under the fence, not go in from the top? The slaughtering seemed to be worse than before, with dead chickens being tossed all over the yard, yet just tore up, not eaten. My sister had gotten a pygmy goat the year before to raise for future farmers of America. One day we found it dead and mutilated as well. It was in a stable yard on the side of our barn with a 6 to 7 feet fence around it, yet something had still gotten to it. Parents still claimed it was dogs. Then one night my sister's boyfriend was having a bonfire party and I went over there with my sister, cause my parents wouldn't let her go to a party without me going with her to watch over her. My sister got really drunk, but I didn't drink much because I was too busy watching over her. I think I had maybe half a beer all night. We left late, maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. When I got home, I would park my truck in the yard next to the driveway, usually facing the chicken coop. I pulled in and my sister just started screaming and pointing forward. I looked up and saw what at the time I could best describe as something that looked like Gollum from Lord of the Rings on the roof of the chicken coop. It was staring right at us, crouched down just like Gollum normally was in the movies. It was a pale white. It had very, very thin hair on top of its head, probably less than Gollum had in the movies. And it had 2 red eyes that glowed in the headlights. It appeared to be hissing at us. I locked the doors and quieted my sister down, then started honking the horn and flashing between my brights and regular headlights. Me and my sister were both freaking out. It jumped off the back of the chicken coop towards the direction of the woods north of the house, and I lost sight of it. My parents had turned on the outside lights at that point and were looking out the door. I grabbed my sister and ran as fast as I could inside with her. When we tried to tell my parents what we saw, they refused to believe us. They told us we were just drunk and full of shit. I tried to tell them I wasn't drunk, but they wouldn't believe me. Sadly, my sister was so drunk, she didn't even remember coming home the next day. A few nights later, we were all gathered in the living room to watch a movie we had rented from the video store. As we were watching the previews, we heard the chickens screeching. My dad was still convinced it was dogs and had a loaded 30-30 rifle by the back door ready for when they showed up again. He ran and grabbed his rifle and a spotlight also near the door and ran out back. Few moments after he went outside, we heard a gunshot followed by continuously firing until he emptied the whole clip. This was very unlike him. Growing up, he taught me and my brother that a good hunter only takes one shot at something. If you need two or more, you're not a good enough shot. He even made us get our first kill with single-load muzzleloader black powder rifles before we could use a regular rifle with a magazine. Never in my entire life had I seen or heard my dad unload a full clip at something. He charged back in and immediately told us kids to go lock all the doors and windows to the house. He was white as a ghost. Meanwhile, he said he needed to talk to my mom. He took my mom into the back room and closed the door where they were at for 20 minutes. I already knew what it was. I was already scared before he even went outside. Me and my brother and sister waited in the living room until they got done talking. I asked him what he saw and he told me he didn't want to talk about it and not to bring it up again. The next day, he and my mom decided to slaughter all the chickens and that we wouldn't be getting more. To this day, my dad still won't talk about what he saw, and nowadays acts like it never happened and plays stupid. I went off to college a couple months later, and I never saw it again after that.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.